Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Erin Tinnen with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Today's webinar will be Trauma-Informed Responses to Emotional Distress and Crisis, an Introduction. Our trainers today will be Cathy Cave and Jennifer Curley from the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Before I get started, I'll go over some of the technical details of the WebEx software that we will be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained on the Using this Webinar System tab on the upper left-hand side of your screen. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending on whether you're using a Mac or a PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. The second from the top is the chat feature. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with myself or the trainers if you have any questions regarding the training content. To do this, you click the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You will see a lot of options, but for this session, you'll want to select all participants if you would like to respond to a question from the trainer or to contact me anytime during the session. You may also contact me, Erin Tinnen, if you have any questions troubleshooting the WebEx software by clicking on my name in the drop-down bar. So let's test this chat feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on all participants, type in the program that you're calling from, and then press enter. Wonderful. Thank you so much for kicking that off. While folks can get a lot out of the chat feature, there are times when it moves really quickly and can feel distracting. If this is true for you, you can feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. We will be providing live captioning during this webinar. Below the chat box, there is a media viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you do not want to see the captions, click on the down-facing arrow next to the word media viewer the same way you might want to hide the chat box. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes the sound cuts out due to internet connection, so if that's true for you, feel free to call in. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact me directly, you may call the WebEx tech support line in order to resolve any additional issues. That phone number, which we will also post in the chat box, is 1-866-229-3239. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will now turn the training over to Cathy.
Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. So again, our webinar is Trauma-Informed Responses to Emotional Distress and Crisis, an Introduction. So Jen and I are going to share presenting and having conversations, and I really appreciate that you all are here. One of the things that we wanted to be sure to communicate is that this is an introduction. We wanted to start a conversation. So we will have future webinars that will talk about all of the topics that come up during this webinar, but we wanted to really provide an opportunity to share the whole picture of what our thinking has been, some origins about where it comes from, and then move forward really thinking about what level of detail would be helpful as we have further conversations about it. So we'll have this overview today that was our thinking as we work together as center as a whole, but we also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the work of Patty Bland, because Patty was very instrumental in working with Jen and I to start this conversation. We worked on it together as a team with other center staff, and so we're both really feeling Patty's presence today. So for those of you who knew Patty, think of this about it as a continuation of her legacy, and I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar. Okay, Jen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yes. Cathy, can you move the slide forward?
Thank you. I can.
Yes, thank you. Great. Hi, everyone. This is Jen. So we're going to start today by coming into the present moment with our breath. And so we start many of our webinars this way, but for this conversation specifically, it's a really important piece of what we'll be talking about today. Our breath and coming into the present moment is one of the most important techniques we have for responding to our own distress, but also to responding to the distress of others. So it allows us to pause and allows us to return to our breath as it's always with us. So so we'll just take a couple of moments. So find a comfortable seated or standing position. So if you need to get up and move around, that's great, or just kind of stay where you're at. And bring attention to your hands. So if your hands are on your lap, if your hands are touching each other, or you can also bring one hand to your heart and another hand to your belly. So any of those things that feel good, or just leave your hands as they are. And when you're ready, we'll take 3 breaths together. So we'll take 1, an inhale, and an exhale. We'll take 2, an inhale, and an exhale. And our last breath, 3, inhale, and exhale. And so we'll incorporate a couple more breathing exercises as well as talk a little bit more specifically about mind-body exercises throughout the webinar, but definitely wanted to start there for today.
Thanks, Jen. So in thinking about an integrated framework for all of the work we do, is how are we holding all of these pieces? Part of what has been helpful in moving forward with thinking about all of the pieces of our work has been to consider that being trauma-informed is a piece of what we're holding. And so this picture represents some of our thinking around that. So if we start with that, we're always thinking about domestic and sexual violence and our understanding of violence and what we know happens in people's lives, and then the impact of those experiences. So we're always holding that, and we understand the impact on mind, body, and spirit, and that there's long-lasting outcomes. We also hold that people are resilient. So when we think about what keeps us present, both in doing the work and for folks who are using our services, we're still here, that we keep our capacity to stay connected to one another as human beings front and center in all of what we do. Part of that is thinking about that we are all part of different cultural and community groups, and trying to think about both our individual identity and our group connections and valuing the meaning that that makes in all of our lives, and that we don't set it aside because we go to work, that there's parts of our ongoing culture and community connections that really does sustain us in what we do. We also are thinking about human rights and social justice, and the lens that provides allows us to really think about and hold the notion that people need to have equity, people need to have access, people need to have a whole way of feeling safe, protected, and right in the world, and that there are laws that support that, and there are processes that support that. So it's bringing all of these pieces together in our work so that we can meet people where they truly are, that we can think about our work as being survivor-defined, that we always are holding the importance of physical and emotional safety and working to both provide that and to participate in it and to have that for ourselves, and understanding that relationship and connection are important. So all of these pieces we're holding at the same time, and there isn't one that's more important than another, but all are necessary to work in ways that are respectful, that honor human experience, that really hold our intention to do well and be well with others in our work. So we will definitely incorporate this more in our work and our future conversations on other webinars as we take a deeper look into all of the conversations we're having today. This is kind of the foundation or scaffolding for what we do and how we do it. When we were thinking about goals for today, this is such a big topic, and wanting to be clear that we won't talk about today everything there is to talk about in our 90 minutes, but to lay a foundation for these are the important pieces and that we can come back and revisit. So what we hope to do today is provide a framework for understanding emotional distress and trauma, to really think about that in deep ways and in ways that are meaningful for our learning and also for sustaining ourselves. We hope to explore perceptions of crisis, and that we look at that in terms of what's our individual experience and system experience and programmatic responses to that, and to consider ways of responding to crisis that are supportive to folks, that are survivor-defined, and are trauma-informed. So as we hold all of these pieces, again, we hope to carry this throughout our time together today. It's also important to think about labels and language and diagnosis, and we wanted to share up front some thoughts about that. There are a wide range of perspectives about mental health and diagnosis, and we know that folks have had various experiences with discrimination because of psychiatric labels. Also that some folks have been incredibly helped by that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But there are different ways of describing both what folks experience, what they call their experiences, and how they make meaning of those things. We don't all use the same terms. We don't all use the word trauma. It doesn't always resonate for folks. So it's what's our experience and how can we talk about it, and then in our work as advocates really listen for how people are describing their own experiences. We also want to always hold a disability justice perspective and really thinking about access in terms of both the physical access and can people benefit from what we're doing. Of course, on the webinar we have captioning. Are there ways that we can make sure that for folks who may have some challenges that we have ways of thinking about that proactively. But we also want to think about accessibility in terms of how welcoming are our services, how accessible in terms of do I see myself reflected here? Does the language we use resonate? Does it make it possible for me to understand in both the languages we speak, but also in the words that we use? So really thinking in terms of a broad way, are we making our services as open and available as possible to everyone who might use them? So that's part of our thinking, even in how we develop training and how we think about the content of things. We also know that there's great value in peer support. So I'm a trauma survivor, and as a survivor, one of the things that's important to me is being able to connect with other folks who have an understanding of what I've experienced or something similar, and that there's an openness and a sharing, and that's been profoundly helpful. And that in all of these pieces, recognizing that stigma and discrimination happen, and sometimes it's very intentional, and sometimes it's systemic, and sometimes people are incredibly unaware, and it's unintentional. So how we hold that these are experiences that people actually have and do shape our ability to be present, our capacity to participate, and our willingness to trust someone. You know, they're all impacted in terms of how these concepts come together in the work that we do. So again, this is an overview to this conversation, and we know we could have a much deeper discussion about all of this. So just asking folks to kind of hold this and keep it in mind as we go forward. And if there are questions and comments or thoughts that come up, to please use the chat box. It'd be great to hear from folks in terms of your thinking about that. When we are thinking about how effective we can be in our work, it's also important to recognize that there are a wide range of views. So we use the term survivor broadly here to kind of talk about folks who've had experience with abuse and violence, and also acknowledging that everyone does not use the term survivor to describe themselves. So for our 90 minutes together today, it's a shorthand that we can use where we're hoping everybody can be on the same page for our time together, knowing that there are differences in views. So in that vein, also thinking about in terms of talking about mental health and challenges around mental health and how people interpret that there's a wide range of views in this area. So folks may range from being really unsure or opposed to, like very clearly opposed to having a diagnosis or a psychiatric label, to on the other side of that, or a different view of that a diagnosis provides understanding and an explanation for what people have been experiencing. So the key in this is really making sure that as we talk with survivors, really being clear about what our own views are in terms of self-awareness, and knowing that anyone we're talking to may have a completely different point of view, and to be open to that perspective. So another way of looking at that is some folks view recovery and healing happening through mental health treatment, and treatment may include medication. And others may view that recovery and healing happens through more holistic approaches or taking social action, and that in and of itself was healing. So I guess where we want to talk more about that and future conversations is really thinking about, even the assumption that if someone would just go get treatment, that in and of itself would be healing. And that may not be their view or their perspective. Can we stay open in our advocacy to all the different ways that people might view what's helpful and what's not helpful? So some folks have been unaware of the impact of trauma, and sometimes learning about trauma and learning about coping strategies actually provides an explanation. So there's from this level of being unaware to being aware of the impact, really understanding the impact on our own responses as advocates, on individual responses for people who are using our services, and that folks are very invested in developing new ways to cope. So part of our responsibility in our advocacy is keeping open this really wide range of views, and that we welcome those conversations, that we're comfortable in having them, and that we look for them, and we may instigate them. We may, put the topic on the table as, I wonder about this, how you think about this, when we're talking to people who are using our services, and when we talk with each other. Part of the reason for the conversations we're having around this are that we do have values and intentions that are connected to domestic and sexual violence advocacy. We are passionate about the work that we do, that we understand the impact and the far-reaching consequences. We understand the individual impact, the political impact. We understand that there's a wide range of undercurrents to what perpetuates violence. We understand that. So we have values and intentions that are very much connected to our work that we're really invested in and believe in. And some of those we've listed here, and this is by no means a comprehensive list. It was really what was happening, as we were talking. So I would also invite folks to use the chat box to really say, if there's something in the values and intentions that you're not seeing and it's something that's really important to you, please share it with us. Just a brief overview here is that our intention is to honor each person's wholeness, that we appreciate people for who they are and what they bring and the resiliencies that they have, and we want to work from that place. We intend to be responsive, to really understand what people's cultural considerations and connections are in terms of identity, personal identity, individual identity, and connections in the community, connections in anyone's whole world. We really want to respect it and understand it and honor it in the work that we do. That we intend to provide dignity and choice in all that we do. We understand powerlessness and do everything that we can to not recreate that sense of powerlessness. We try to use first-person language and really respect that people are people first, that we're human beings, and whatever label I may have been given doesn't define me. It may be a diagnosis that I have. It may be something that it's a label for what I'm experiencing, but it doesn't define me as a human being. That we intend to not re-traumatize people. We intend to really hold the idea of physical and emotional safety at the heart of our relationships, and making sure that we do everything in our power not to recreate the dynamics of abuse or neglect or feeling powerless or using power over someone else. So we want to be in this place, and we desire to be in this place, to stay connected and to provide access to everything that we do. So to do that, we want to think about and do think about not being judgmental and trying to avoid putting folks in positions where we are judging them and we don't understand. We have this capacity for knowledge about the impact of violence. So again, we try to do everything we can to counter that. And those are guiding principles and values and intentions of our work. So what we also know is that there's some things that get in the way of our work. So these are, again, some things we thought about in terms of what gets in the way. And you all may have some other ideas about what gets in the way of the work. And feeling effective and feeling engaged and connected and grounded in the way that we do things. So some of the things that came up are here, worrying about what if. What if, I can't be helpful? What if someone doesn't appreciate what we're trying to do and doesn't understand our intention? What if we're not acting in line with our intentions? What if I say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing or offer something that's not quite right? And sometimes in the worrying about what if, we get caught up and stop short of being helpful or do something that's really unhelpful, even though our intentions are good. Sometimes the what gets in the way has to do with information, or I just don't know about something. I may not know about a resource in the community that's helpful. So in thinking about the information gaps, one of the things, again, I would invite you all to do, if there's something at any time during our time together today that you feel is like, oh, this would be really good information to have, please share it. I think a large part of what gets in the way can be our own experiences with abuse and violence and trauma and microaggressions and discrimination and stigma. It's our own experience that we carry every day. So someone may say, there's it's kind of a flippant thing of, oh, you leave your stuff at the door. The reality is we don't leave anything outside. Often what we're experiencing and what we're feeling in the moment is present and active, and it's with us. So rather than ignoring those things, what we hope to have conversation about in this series of webinars is how do we manage what we're carrying and holding and experiencing, rather than acting as if it doesn't exist. So it's like let some of that stuff play out in a more transparent way in the work that we do. So we've already talked about labeling a little bit, and there are different views about that. So if I choose as a survivor to call myself a survivor, to explain some of the ways that I cope and the ways that I'm living in my day-to-day as having depression, then I'm choosing to name that. But for someone else to name that, for me, is not okay. So it's really important that we talk about how people express what they're experiencing, the names that they put on things. But when we don't, when we do that to others, that we may be doing something that's disconnecting our relationships, and we're then acting outside of our intentions because we can't connect. So there's fear about what would be helpful. It's the not knowing and the what if and what if I do the wrong thing. Again, what we hope to do is to provide some conversation about what is helpful. But I think that, some of you all have experienced some things that have helped in the moment, and that would also be good to share. Not being aware of crisis plans and policies or being able to act on them. So most organizations do have and have put some thought into designing plans and policies to help navigate some of the challenges in crisis. But we may not have them or can't call them up in the moment when something is happening because we're involved and we're in the mix. So it's part of what we're thinking about as we're having these conversations about our responses to crisis is really around, are there plans as one piece, and are there policies, and are there ways that we can help folks to be more able to access those plans in the moment? So that's something to talk about, in your organizations as well. So how do we make our services more welcoming, accessible, and supportive, no matter what folks are experiencing in the moment? So when there's a mental health challenge or crisis, is there something more that we can do that feels welcoming, that feels more connected, that feels more real, more tangible that people can do in the moment. And that's what we're hoping to do throughout this webinar series. Okay. Jen, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Yes. So we're going to spend a few minutes looking at what is underneath distress and crisis for folks and what might be happening for someone underneath the surface. And we'll start by defining trauma. And so we often, in our work, right, and in the world, we use the word trauma to talk about a lot of things. So we're often looking at the source or the traumatic event, but we're also talking about the experience of trauma or the effects of trauma. And at the center, when we use the word trauma, we're holding both individual trauma as well as collective and historical trauma. We're holding that people have experiences that have happened in the past and are also experiencing abuse, violence, oppression currently. And when we're thinking about individual trauma, we talk about when an individual has experienced a threat to their life or to their integrity or to someone that they love or have witnessed something, but also when that experience overwhelms someone's ability to integrate or to metabolize that experience, and that experience is overwhelmed. And when we're thinking about ongoing and historical collective trauma, we're talking about systemic violence, slavery, colonization, genocide, oppression, both historically that has happened to folks, but also the things that continue to happen day to day and the ways that that impacts people day to day. So we're thinking of the big, right, but we're thinking about the ways that those, all of those experiences of trauma and violence affect people in their day-to-day ways, and exactly what Cathy was saying in terms of what people are bringing with them. We don't leave those things at the door. And so in thinking about potential sources of trauma, we're not going to go through everything on this list, but want to take a moment to recognize that in our work doing domestic violence and sexual violence advocacy, we're often really focused on the experiences of either domestic violence or sexual violence, but often the folks that we're working with are bringing in lots of other experiences or had a lot of other experiences. And we may not see that, or we may not understand what someone is experiencing or coming in with, either from the past or that's happening for them currently. And this last point, any misuse of power by one person or group over another, was something that we really wanted to highlight as a potential source of trauma, especially in thinking about how we're responding to crises and how we're using power in those moments so that we can be responsive in ways that aren't re-traumatizing to people. And so as we're thinking about distress, we're really looking at the effects of trauma. And as we're holding today, we're looking again at what's going on underneath the surface. And so how many people have heard of fight, flight, or freeze? So that's something that I think has started to come into our understanding about what's going on underneath the surface for folks, or what a survival response looks like. And we could spend a day, I think, on this one slide having this conversation about really what's going on when people are responding to danger and when people's systems are responding to danger. But what we want to hold for today's conversation is the way that our whole systems as humans, so our bodies, our brains, our emotions, we're wired for survival. And both wired in ways that help us survive physically, but also we're wired in for relationship to each other. As human beings, we're relational beings. And so when information comes in both from internal sources like our heart rate or our muscle tension or breath, but also from our environment, that information gets sorted by our brain so quickly into either a bucket of it's dangerous or it's not dangerous. And if it registers as danger, it sends a signal that sounds an alarm in our brain, so it sounds that alarm system, and our response is either fight, flight, or freeze, and that is happening automatically. And the speed and the automatic ways in which that's happening is on purpose. It allows us to act in ways as quickly as we need to. If we were thinking about it, we would be moving too slowly. And we know that this is happening all the time. And it might feel really noticeable, so we might notice that when we're having that kind of response, or it might be happening outside of our awareness, or it might become it might feel like a very familiar way of moving through the world. And some of that might be really visible to other folks or not visible and hidden underneath the surface. And we know that information is shaped by our past and our current experiences of violence, oppression, and safety. And for any of us, what sounds that alarm, so that activates that fight, flight, freeze response, may either be a reminder from the past, might be something that's currently happening in the moment or a combination of both of those things. And so we know that trauma overwhelms that survival system that we were just talking about. It overwhelms our nervous systems, our coping, our ability to regulate our internal states and rhythms. And often we talk about this as dysregulation, so what's happening underneath. That our whole system becomes sensitized to responding to constant threat. And it happens in all aspects of ourselves, right? So our thoughts, our emotions, our bodies and our movements, so the ways that, like our physical awareness, our energy levels, and not just our thinking about safety, but our felt sense of safety in the world and our felt sense of connection with other people and our ability to be in the present moment. All of those things get sensitized and organized around responding to danger. Cathy?
All right. So as we think about then, excuse me, what it means to have the alarm constantly on, is that when we are constantly prepared for, expecting, and threat or danger, and it's not that the threat is in the past, and that's one of the things I think that's true for, there are lots of different potential sources of trauma and violence. But when there's this present threat or it's a current threat, then it makes sense that we would be on alert, we would be prepared. And often I think something that happens in our advocacy work is that we're prepared for that threat when it's related to what we're expecting. So when I'm aware that someone has experience with interpersonal violence and that's why they're here for services, or that's why we're having the conversation, that's why we're talking, I'm expecting that that's happened. But there may be all kinds of other sources of violence that folks have had where they're still holding that current expectation that the threat is present. So our bodies and brains are on constant alert, and by telling us that, oh yes, you're safe, that may not help turn off the alarm. So as a woman of color, I'm often on alert for how others are going to treat me in any given moment because of past experience, and that is one source of threat and among many. So it's thinking about that then, how does that play out in our work, and what might that look like? So what it might look like, and here are some suggestions, and again, I would invite folks to, please share with us if there are other ideas that come up for you. So being overwhelmed or having really strong reactions to things that seem to other people that they're minor and no big deal, but that it's, having a strong reaction to that in the moment. But that makes sense as a survival skill. It makes sense as this is what happens for a person, or any person. Constantly scanning for danger and worrying that something bad will happen. Well, if that's helped me stay alive, I'm not going to give that up because it might be annoying to somebody else, or it might be bothersome, or that sometimes the way that we cope is that we numb or check out because that's what allowed us, to live or to sustain ourselves in that moment. So not being able to get over things that happen in the day-to-day. There's this constant sense of accumulative, oh, this is happening again, and there's more of that, and that's happening, and it just seems to be this growing pile of things that a person can't get over, and yet they're things that happen, many times a day for many of us. So it's knowing that no matter what we expect that someone might look like because they're in a trauma response, it also may be a response that's new to you or is unique to them. So sometimes it's that disengaging or avoiding interactions that, puts up a sense of safety. It allows someone to survive, and it allows someone to cope with whatever's happening around them. And sometimes we're in pretty chaotic environments, and it feels that that's a way of being safe. Minimizing or compartmentalizing, a small thing and I'll keep going. One of the things I think about compartmentalizing is that sometimes that's a skill that's valued. If I can put aside, some things that I'm experiencing, and I can put aside my pain, I can focus on this thing over here and do that really well and be really successful at it. So one of the things I like to say when I'm talking with folks is that, sometimes I make distress look really good, but that's because I'm compartmentalizing, or I'm able to, push something so far away it's out of my present. And that is good and not good. And it may help me in the moment, but it may not help me in the next moment. But it's also looking at that some of the ways we cope means that we can't plan right now, and that there's a way of, when folks are overwhelmed, of self-protection that also means I can't be fully present and talk about what we're going to do, what was best for me, what would be helpful to do, even to recognize well-intentioned partners, people who want to be supportive of me for my planning. So it's holding space open that people's experiences with trauma and violence and this level of stress and this level of dysregulation can prevent people from doing things that they really do want for themselves. They just may not be able to tell you that in the moment. So how does this help us respond differently? And I would ask folks to think about that. I mean, part of what we'd like to do in the rest of our conversation today is to really be thinking about how does knowing this help us to be more supportive, more welcoming, more open, more available, more present for folks that we're serving, but also to recognize that this information also is good about us. It's good for us to know about ourselves and what we're experiencing in our advocacy and in our own personal lives. We're all human beings, and all of us, are impacted by trauma. So when we think about those pieces, shifting our views really does mean as we're holding all these pieces around social justice and being culturally attuned and recognizing the impact of violence and thinking about our advocacy work, that we often don't see what's happening for folks. Often what we see are the ways that people are coping, and then often we're judgmental about people's coping. So we can be present for a little bit, and then it's hard to stay connected. It's hard to stay respectful. It can be hard to stay present. So it's thinking about that this isn't willful. How people are responding in the moment, we're doing whatever we can to survive. And so how do we hold that in our thinking as we go forward in the work that we do, as we think about how people are in crisis and how can we respond differently. So people are doing the best that they can, and coping strategies are helping. And again, sometimes because we can't see what's underneath, or we can't hold all the pieces that we're seeing, or that even when we explain it to each other, so I may be talking with another survivor and saying, this is something I see. Well, they may not be aware of how they're responding in the moment. And we also may not be seeing and experiencing all that they are experiencing. So there's a complex relationship that we're holding that involves people being aware of how they're responding or unaware, and that the responses can be visible or they can be invisible, and that we don't see it all and we don't understand it all, and we often can't then hold it all. So, someone was saying in the responses about, in the chat box about how important it is to give folks time to tell us and explain to us what their views are and what they're experiencing. And that would be incredibly helpful when people are able to tell us to really, be clear about that, to be clear that we want to stay open and available. So Jen, would you like to do a breathing piece?
Sure, yeah. So we just wanted to take a moment, since we've been sitting probably for a while, so either to stretch or just to take a moment to come back to our breath. So if you used your hand on your heart and belly, you could do that again, or hands on your lap. But just to take a moment again, we'll take one breath together. So we'll take an inhale and an exhale. And I think just good reminders for all of us that it's available, and it's so easy to forget to do that. I know that that's true for me as well. Cathy?
Mm-hmm. All set?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we're going to move forward and talk about exploring distress and crisis. It's funny, what happened for me just now is that I was taking a breath and thought, oh, I need another one. And I think that's important. It's when we really are talking about distress and crisis, how do we really pay attention to where we are as advocates in this conversation? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what could be helpful. So attending to the impact of trauma on the organizational level really does mean thinking about that there are things that we encounter in our lives and in our work that are stressful and traumatic on both us as individuals and on our whole organization. So when something is impacting the organization, it then does impact the staff who work in an organization. And when there's something that impacts the staff, it's also impacting people who are accessing our services. And that this is a unit. We are a living, breathing organism as a whole organization. So when things are impacting folks who are accessing services, there's an impact on staff and there's an impact on organizations as a whole. One of the things I noticed in the chat box a little while ago was a conversation around, how survivors are impacted when the work environment that we're operating in is toxic, and that there's a truth to that. So it's not, when one part of the system is impacted, we're all impacted. So when we talk about creating supports that are accessible and welcoming, we really do have to think about, what does this mean for all of us as we're all, in this together. So we all have, and by all I mean those of us who are working in organizations, providing advocacy services, really thinking about our communities even as a whole. But in our work, we all have beliefs that develop that are based on how we understand trauma, how we understand and explain our own experience, how we connect to our own cultural considerations and identities, and that comes into our work. So we have beliefs and we have values, and we have assumptions that then shape our environments in the work that we do. So related to this is like, how do we hold, this larger context of violence and oppression in our day-to-day work? A lot of that is based in what do we believe in some fundamental ways. So if we're incorporating this more integrated approach and thinking about all of these aspects together, then our work is informed by both our values and the new information we can take in. But it needs to fit for us. So I need to have some openness, personal openness, to thinking about culture and inclusion. And what I believe about that is going to be carried out in how I do my work day to day. What I believe about safety and what safety means for myself is going to influence how I think others are safe and what they need to feel safe. Now, part of this conversation is really making sure that we are working in ways where survivors are defining for themselves, what does it mean to feel safe, and that each of us as advocates and as staff who work in organizations are clear about what does safety mean, what does self-care mean, what is well-being, and how do we make our own contributions to that. In our work as colleagues and in partnership with people who access services, who's defining what's helpful, and how do we listen to that? How do we honor that? And when we're talking about people being resilient and strong and having strengths that they can bring to their own survival, how are we talking about that with folks? And how do we move that strength-based conversation more to the top of the list rather than, either something we get to down the road or something that we forget about because in responding to crisis, we're trying to put an end to something. So when things get stressful, we draw from what we know. So part of the conversation around effectiveness in crisis is how do we broaden what we know and what we're willing to tap into and able to tap into. So when we're thinking about crisis in this way, what we'd ask folks to consider is that in the environment where someone is in distress or there's crisis, that there's the person who's being perceived or identified as being in crisis. There are people or a person who's trying to support someone in crisis, and there are other people in the environment. So sometimes what happens in responding to crisis is that if I'm working, if I'm a staff person, if I'm an advocate, I'm trying to be supportive to the person who looks to me to be in immediate distress. And I may not include thinking about how are other people present involved in this mix. Or I may not be thinking about what's my own stuff. I have a colleague who says, what's my nickel in this quarter? It's thinking about that the environment is created by the sum of all that's in it. So when we're thinking about how to intervene, how to be supportive, attention to, as a supporter, what do I need? As someone who is in need of support, what might that person need? And what's needed for the other folks that are in the environment to either engage them in a more positive way or to think about asking for some space or creating some space. So part of our conversation around this is really thinking about the environment as a whole and what we can do to be supportive for all the folks that are involved in the mix.
So when we started these conversations a while ago, starting to think about what is distress and what is crisis and starting to think about how to define them, we realized that there are really different definitions out there. So what does it mean to be in emotional or mental health distress? What does it mean to be in crisis? And is there a difference between those things and who defines that? And so that brought us to a lot of questions. So again, what is the difference between those things? How do we understand crisis? How does a person understand crisis? And then how does our understanding of those things change how we're responding, both as individuals and as organizations? So one of the definitions that we're thinking about for distress is that it's great pain, anxiety, sorrow, or suffering. And that, again, we can add a lot to that definition, and very much is how someone defines distress is very much defined by themselves, right? And then when we're thinking about crisis, is there a line, and does something shift from being an experience of distress to being an experience of crisis, and vice versa, so going from crisis back down to distress? And so when Cathy and I were really thinking about these things together, we came up with this as a definition of crisis that we'll use for this webinar and in our conversations moving forward. So that in order to kind of meet that definition of crisis, that a situation or experience feels out of control or overwhelming for the person. That supports, so the things that people are using as supports or coping strategies that usually work are no longer working in that moment. So someone's trying a lot of different things that they know that works, and none of those things are helping. That in that moment, the distress is either staying the same or it continues to increase. And then these last two pieces, that there's in that moment that the person is unsure if it'll get better or be okay, and or there's fear that something is happening that's dangerous, so that there's something that's dangerous that's happening. So it's this configuration of things that shifts something from feeling really hard or really overwhelming and challenging, or where someone feels like they're really struggling, to a place that feels like a crisis. And then we're really thinking about, so using that definition, is it a crisis for the person who's experiencing distress? So are they saying, this is a crisis for me? Is it a crisis for us as supporters or as advocates? Or is it both? So are we both in an experience of feeling like it's crisis? And so we know a couple of things that help. So one, I think remembering that someone may be in distress but not in crisis. So we may perceive them being in crisis, but they may not feel like it's a crisis for them. But and connected to that, our attitude and our stance, so how we're approaching someone, how we're approaching the situation makes a really big difference. It matters a lot. And that we know that our response to someone can really make a difference in whether or not someone returns to a place or comes to a place of feeling okay, or it increases their feeling of distress. So how we respond to someone can really make a difference in their level of distress or their level of crisis. And that the ways that we act, so how do we continue to act in line with our intentions so that the ways that we're responding to someone don't mirror experiences that they've already had in abusive relationships or experiences of violence, so that the feeling of loss of control, loss of voice, loss of choice, not being believed, the use of force, so that we're not recreating those things in how we're responding to someone when they're experiencing distress or crisis. And Cathy talks about this a lot, this last piece, that uncomfortable does not equal unsafe. And being able to really sit with, for ourselves, whether or not something is uncomfortable or unsafe takes both time and reflection and conversations with each other. And so if we think about what would a trauma-informed crisis support response, or what does trauma-informed crisis support look like? So going back to that image of the circle where we're thinking about all the people involved, we're thinking about what does trauma-informed crisis support look like both for the person experiencing distress or crisis, as well as for the person who's supporting them. So if we are supporting someone who's in distress or is experiencing crisis, what do we need to be able to provide the best kind of support that we can? And we created a handout for y'all that that got sent out and that you'll have access to afterwards, and it has the values and intentions that we talked about, as well as started to create a list of what might it feel like for someone who's experiencing distress or crisis when they're supported in a way that feels trauma-informed, and what might it look like for the person supporting. So there's a lot of similarities in terms of feeling like there's choices and options and that someone's believed and supported. And so I would invite all of us to add to that list, to change it, and to have those conversations in our teams and among our staff.
Thanks. So one of the things that we have committed to, and I mentioned this earlier, is that there are some concrete tools available to folks. So Jen shared just one. There are other concrete tools that we'll hope to share during this webinar series, and that this conversation in and of itself is one of those tools. So to think about organizational policies and practices, we'll have conversations about that. A deeper look at some mind-body practices. We know that there's some good resources in that mind-body connection and having some practical tools that we can use. Really paying attention to our physical and sensory environments. Are there things we can do in our environments, now that could be helpful, that would make things more comfortable, support physical and emotional safety, and also to help avoid adding to folks' distress and crisis. So, and then ideas that when someone can tell us what's happening for them, that's great, it's helpful, we can be responsive to what we're hearing. But we also need ideas for when people can't tell us what they need. So these are some of the things that we're going to cover in the rest of our time together today, but also thinking about, future webinars, we'll be taking a deeper look in each of these areas. So tools that include organizational policies and practices. Helping anything that helps us to, in our organizations and our programs, to be able to plan ahead. So is there an effective crisis response policy? So one of the things that can be helpful is, whether it's in a staff meeting or if it's, something that we pull out and leave out and accessible for folks to actually take a look at and weigh in on, is this effective? Are people clear about what it says? Does it feel possible to do? And to get some feedback about that from folks who are doing the work as they're doing the work. So when there's not time of crisis, revisiting the policy and see, is this really helpful? And how could we make it more helpful? Other tools and resources really involve looking at and working with and examining existing rights provisions and really taking a look at, do we incorporate this? Can we do better at incorporating the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Fair Housing Act? Do we understand the provisions of the Civil Rights Act? And are we making sure that people have language access? And that all of that information is incorporated into our policies and practices so that when we need something, it's accessible and easy for us to get to in the work that we're doing, and that folks at least are aware of where to find it. And if not, those are some fixes that can occur to make that information readily available so we have it in the moment. Do we have community partnerships in place that are where we can have support if crisis occurs and we need outside supports? Do we have existing practices? Do we have relationships that make sense? But do we also have relationships where folks who are also concerned about, care about, work with folks in the community that we're working with? Do we have those relationships in place? Do we know folks? Do we have trustworthy practitioners in terms of folks who provide mental health services or substance use services? Do we have people who work with culturally specific organizations that we have partnerships that make sense? Do we have access to medication policies that make sense for what people are actually experiencing, and have we talk with folks about what would be helpful for them? Are those policies flexible? Do our practices actually align with what our policies say? So when we're thinking about mental health concerns and medication management and substance use, are the folks everyone who works in an organization, are we on the same page as our policies say that we should be on or that we intend to be on? So it's really thinking about, are they flexible? Does everyone know about them? And does it feel possible to do in the moment? And can we incorporate feedback that survivors give us about what does and doesn't work? And do we have multiple ways of doing that? So again, we'll have a deeper conversation around some of these ideas, but it's in the short term, do our policies and practices align with treating people with dignity and respect? And does everyone know what those policies actually are? And can we act on them? We need to keep in mind, too, that we're all continually healing. So if we think about that whole environment where crisis can happen and does exist, it's remembering that each person that's connected in that moment is a human being and we're healing. So restoring a sense of safety and protection needs to come, and it needs to be part of our crisis response, and it needs to be continually available in ways that support building trustworthy relationships. And what's the role for supervision in that? How do we best support advocates as we do our work in the day-to-day and think about reflective practices and processes where we can talk about what happened, we can think through thoughts and feelings about that, we can talk through thoughts and feelings, we can check for perspective around, are there other ways? Who else was impacted? How were people impacted? And then collaboration and supervision to move forward. So again, these are very much larger conversations, but really thinking about what's the connection between our policies, our practices, and how we support each other to actually carry out the work that we do. So the next set of tools Jen's going to talk about.
Yes. So we know that mind-body practices can be really helpful for folks, and it's one of the areas at the center that we're working to develop more of in terms of tools and resources that folks can use kind of on the go and are adapted or made shorter, so knowing that we often need those kinds of practices in our work. And so going back to our earlier conversation, we know that mind-body practices, for the research supports this, that they help address the overwhelm and the dysregulation in our bodies and in our nervous systems. And this is especially important given that sometimes we don't know what we're experiencing, or we don't know how to express what we're talking about, or what we're experiencing, or that we don't, the ways that we have to talk about it are either increasing our agitation or distress. And so we've been working on sharing mind-body practices that are free, the ones that can be shared and learned really easily, and also ones that can be used in situations when other resources aren't available. And so I know a lot of folks have used our, we have a handout on our website called the finger hold practice to manage emotions and stress, and folks have found that really helpful in that being able to use, advocates being able to use it for themselves, but also to share it with survivors they're working with, especially in situations like court or in other places where people may not have access to other kinds of resources. And so again, we created a two-page handout that looks at how to use some mind-body practices, gives some examples of things that you could start using today and start sharing with other folks, and you'll have that with you. And this is one of the areas where we will be doing a lot more training and webinars on. And so for us, we think about what, as advocates, we think about what helps us regulate and reset. So what are the things that we already do? What are the things that we'd like to try that help us get back to a place of grounding or calm, or that help us pause when we're feeling really overwhelmed or really stretched? And so I know that there are a lot of things that people are already practicing both organizationally and that you're incorporating in your day-to-day work. And then what are the things that we'd like to try or add? And so this is a short list of some of the things that we know to be helpful. So breathing, some of the things that we've incorporated today, self-soothing exercises, grounding, simply taking breaks, so stepping away or moving away from our work for a few moments, taking breaks with colleagues, feeling connected again, using visualization and imagining, both in terms of imagining situations that we might have to be in and how to prepare for them, but also using positive visualization, other mindfulness practices, and some of those got mentioned in some of the webinars we've done recently with mindfulness-based stress reduction, or some of the webinars that Stephanie Covington did, movement, and then there are a lot of other things that we could add to this list, and we'll continue to add to this list.
So one of the things that I think is important to think about is that when we're talking about what's helpful for survivors in terms of being able to reset and re-regulate, that these are the same practices that can be helpful as advocates and doing the work. So it's really, I wanted to just kind of echo something that Jen said about, what are we willing to try? So there are things in the physical and sensory environment that we really need to pay attention to, but there's also some of the tools and resources that we were talking about with mind-body practice and talking about, having a reflective process and supervision, that these are all examples of tools that can help folks regulate and reset. And that in our physical environment, in our work environments, some of the things we need to consider is, how is the space itself welcoming? And how do we express that? How do we really think about if someone's coming in, or if I work in this space every day, what makes it feel welcoming and inclusive to me? What might be welcoming and inclusive to someone else? So there's a piece of this work, and of this conversation rather, that really is about how we create environments that folks who are doing the work and folks who are accessing services all see as welcoming, inclusive, attentive to the sensory impact. Our lives are sometimes chaotic because of the environments and the kind of work we do. So are there spaces that allow us to stretch, to pause, to regulate and reset, to be reflective, to talk with supervisors, to talk with colleagues, to support sustaining our empathy day in and day out doing the work that we do. And that overall, is there a sense of physical and emotional safety? And part of that is, if the answer to that is I'm not sure, or maybe the answer to that is, well, not yet, or the answer to that is no, or sometimes, then it's up to us as communities of work to really think about how can we change the space. Sometimes it's lighting, sometimes it's sound, sometimes it's, do we have choices, not choices? So really thinking about in a practical way what's available, what's possible, what can I do for myself, what can I offer to others that will support self-awareness and really implementing some self-care practices that feel possible and doable, and we're hopeful about them, that help sustain resilience. So there's a wide range of experiences that folks have. So how do we make it possible that one environment can be attentive to multiple people's experiences and then the multiple kinds of experiences that one person might have? So those are the kinds of questions that might be helpful. And I guess just want to, mention the ACDVTI tool. So it's a tool that helps guide kind of creation of or thinking about or exploration of environments and services and programs that are accessible, that are culturally responsive, that attend to the physical and sensory impact, that really tend to physical and emotional safety, and really support what we know happens to folks because of experiences with trauma and violence. So it's thinking about how do we reflect that, and we have some tools on our website that can help with that. The other piece to think about in terms of environmental supports is, can we have opportunities where people can actually add to the environment in a way that helps folks feel that they can make a contribution themselves? So is there something that if I'm coming in that I can do, that I have choice and that my contribution is welcomed and honored, and thinking creatively about ways to do that in the settings where we work. When we think about the sensory impact and creating emotional safety, here's some thoughts about what might be challenging and then things that might be trauma reminders for folks. So noise and chaos and just a level of sensory stimulation that's outside. Someone had put in the comments earlier, your 911 is not my 911, in the same way that what's calming and soothing for one person might not be for someone else, and what is overwhelming for one person may not be overwhelming for someone else. So how do we balance, physical space needs and privacy needs? And part of that is we need to talk with folks about what works for them. So it's understanding their experience, but also allowing the opportunity for folks to say, these are the things that are more distressing for me. Can we do something about that? So it's honoring those conversations when they happen. And really talking with folks about sharing their experiences. We often have responses to help people share, but we might not address that in a way that is both supportive and, has an opportunity or creates an opportunity to talk about what other folks are experiencing. So it's how do we open up opportunities for those kinds of discussions, and also give people lots of different ways to express themselves. So, sometimes we have to change the conversation by providing different ways of having conversations through art and other ways of expression, body movement, some of those kinds of things. So the things that work. So here are some things that might be helpful. Again, calming, soothing colors and decor. Again, what's calming to some might not be calming to another. Brightness and soft lighting. I need really bright lights for my own sense of safety and being willing to work. So soft lighting might not work for me, but can we do both in our space? Can we figure out how to do that, as an example? Quiet spaces to be with other people or to be alone. Spaces where there's something to do that folks can choose to join, but you don't have to ask permission to join. It's just available. So how do we, again, have environments that are flexible enough that offer these opportunities to be inside or outside, or, to have art supplies available, or to just be quiet and be still and having options around that so it doesn't feel like there are no options. One of our other, we talked about this a little bit, but sometimes it is a challenge to actually talk with people about what helps them. So in our rush sometimes to gather information, we often don't pause enough or frequently enough to ask others about what is helpful. So how we know that something helps is we actually ask people, and they can tell us. But we need to ask when they're not in crisis, when there can be some thoughtfulness and some calm approach and quiet around the conversation, where it doesn't feel urgent and it doesn't feel, if I don't answer this right now, then I won't get a chance to answer this later, kind of thing. So it's giving folks plenty of opportunity, and ask me today and I may tell you one thing, ask me tomorrow or later today, I may tell you something else. So it's being flexible about what we hear and really talking with folks about what's helpful. And here's some questions that could also help guide that conversation. So when you are overwhelmed or distressed, what does that look like? What does that feel like? So unpacking that conversation. So it's not just what helps, but to unpack it some and say, okay, we have a few minutes and it seems quiet right now. Let's check in. What adds to your stress or distress? And remembering that we don't all call it trauma. So what adds? What is distressing? What has helped in the past when you felt this way? And I love this. Are there things that we can do or things that we cannot do that are supportive? It's really opening up so many different ways to ask the questions and to have the conversations so that folks feel our presence and don't feel as if, again, if I don't answer this right now, I won't get another chance. We'll ask again, we'll check in, and we're here. So it's thinking about, again, how do we do that in ways that communicates that whatever you tell me, I'm okay to hear it. I'm present to hear it. And I don't have, maybe I can't do everything, but maybe there are some things we can do together to figure out and navigate what might work for you and what might be helpful. Something that can help is actually providing information about trauma. Again, sometimes we shy away from the conversations because it may be hard to have. But it's really common when you've experienced what you've experienced, when you've gone through what you have, that folks may have a hard time sleeping, that sometimes it's hard to settle in. So here are some ways to start the conversation and also to continue the conversation, to begin a conversation that allows for an exchange of ideas, an exchange of conversation around what's helpful. And sometimes it's okay to be quiet and just be, and sometimes it's okay to get involved. Let's find out what might be helpful for you, and that different messages are helpful at different times in folks' experience. Actually talking about diagnosis can help. So that conversation we had earlier about that there's a range of survivor views, talking about diagnosis gives us a chance to learn more about what their views actually are and to be able to sit and listen and hold that. So, a pretty common question to be asked is, do you have meds? So before we ask, it's fine to ask, but don't let that be the only question. So let's understand first how people see and describe their experience. What do you call that? What does it feel like for you when that's happening? Is there anything that helps when that's happening? Is there some way we can be helpful to you or something that you'd rather we didn't do? So I think the other piece for us in our advocacy is holding that there are lots of people who had experiences of being misdiagnosed or overdiagnosed or being on medication that wasn't helpful or helped for a little while. So again, it's opening up our compassion around the range of views and experiences that people have had, and let's talk about that. Let's understand both what survivors' experiences with systems and other providers are, but as advocates, we also need to have connections within our organizations to figure out ways, if I don't have information or the capacity to answer a question, well, I don't know, let's go find out. Sometimes survivors have lots of information about what's helpful to them in terms of even thinking about mental health and diagnosis. So talking about that can be incredibly helpful.
So we're going to spend this last little section of our time today thinking about what are some ideas that are helpful when someone can't tell you what they need. And so we know that often folks can't tell you what they need, right? So either because people are feeling really overwhelmed, that what Cathy was saying about earlier about the ways that our responses might get in the way of planning, or being able to think and to know what we need in a moment. So when we're feeling overwhelmed, it becomes harder. And sometimes people do know what they need, but can't tell you, because being able to ask for what we need or being able to tell someone what we need is an experience that requires trust and a lot of vulnerability, which may not be possible in that moment. And so so here's some ideas for when someone's experiencing crisis and can't tell us what they need. And so these are adapted from de-escalation techniques developed by the American Association for Emergency Psychiatry. And so they're ideas. It's not like a step-by-step recipe, but it's some things that we know that can be helpful when someone can't tell you what they need, but they're experiencing crisis or overwhelm. And so much of it seems really basic, right? It's a lot of stuff that we're doing already or that we know how to do, but when we're in a place of feeling overwhelmed or when someone is really struggling, it can be hard to remember to do these things, or it can be hard to remember to do them intentionally. And a lot of them are about how we are. So it's not so much what we're saying or like that there's an exact way of doing it, but it's about how we're communicating, how we are and how we're being with someone. And we know that we do a lot of that through our tone, through our body language, through our energy, our facial expressions, and our attention. And we all know what it feels like, I hope, to be sitting across from someone who really gets us, what it feels like when someone's really with us and paying attention to what we're saying and is really there with us and not judging us. And that so much of that gets communicated non-verbally. And so how are we communicating that when someone's experiencing distress and crisis? Because we know that our presence and the presence of someone who's actually there and actually bearing witness is one of the most important elements when someone's experiencing crisis, and that crisis itself can be really isolating and really overwhelming. And so how do we bring our genuine presence and respect and selves to that interaction? How do we create connection in the ways that are possible? And we also know that sometimes someone may be having a hard time taking in our presence because of what they're experiencing, and so may take extra grounding on our part. So some of the ideas that we know that one staff person leads, so we're thinking about if we're working in our programs, so one staff person leads, meaning that the person who's experiencing crisis or distress isn't overwhelmed or crowded by a lot of people asking a lot of questions or creating sort of closeness in space. That we work to make a genuine connection with someone, that we ourselves are clear and calm and focused. And so all the things that we know or need to practice in order to be able to do that. That if we've had conversations with folks, that we know what they might want for themselves, and then we're able to consider that and bring that into the conversation. That we create space. So if someone needs space or needs someone to come in closer, that we respect and we honor that, and we are paying attention to that. And this piece about taking our time, that how do we communicate? So even if we actually don't have a lot of time, how do we communicate to someone that we have all the time in the world, even if we don't, so that there's a feeling about our interaction that doesn't feel rushed, even if we may be short on time. So, and I think it's a real art to be able to do that, and something that we can practice with each other. That we stay collaborative and we offer choices. That we use really simple, concise language. Again, if someone is having a hard time thinking or being able to take in what you're saying, that the more simple and more clear our language is, the better. And that we acknowledge and validate what someone's experience is real, so we're not challenging what someone's experiencing. And so so again, adapted from the folks at the American Association for Emergency Psychiatry, that they use this sort of three-step process, and again, not meant to be rigid, but to help offer us a model for when we're in situations where we might need some additional resources. And so it's listen, validate, and then offer action that is possible in the moment. So listen, validate, or acknowledge that what's happening is happening, and then we offer action that's possible in the moment. And so I want to take a couple of moments to look at each of these closely and to think about listening. And we start with this quote from Diane Wolf, one of our colleagues at the Coalition in Wisconsin, who listens really deeply. And she talks about that we listen to hear, that we actually are really working to hear what someone else is experiencing and what they're saying. So we're not listening to talk, or we're not waiting for our turn to intervene or to offer advice, but we're really listening to what that person is experiencing in the moment. I think it's really hard. So it sounds really simple, but I think it's a really hard thing to do at times, and especially if we ourselves are worried about how we're going to respond or we're not sure how to respond. And again, we listen to what's both being said, so what someone's saying, but also to what might be happening underneath. What are the feelings that are there? Is there anger? Is there fear? Does someone feel not seen or not heard? So we're listening for both of those things. And again, what we've talked about in terms of the ways that we're communicating through our body language and our presence. And so when we offer action that's possible in the moment, we're really thinking about what's possible in that very, very moment. So when someone's experiencing crisis or in crisis and not able to tell you what feels possible to them in that moment. And I think it takes some trial and error. And so sometimes we might offer something that someone will be like, yes, that's what I need right now, and sometimes it'll be no. And so it's just playing around and trying to figure out with what might be supportive or feel possible in that moment. So that's both for the person you're supporting and for you. So what can you offer? Do we know from that person what helps them again? And that we might think back to, are there things that have helped other people in similar situations that we might want to try or offer? And that we're always offering but not prescribing or directing or saying you have to do this, or that it feels like an invitation, and someone's able to really say yes or no. And that so when we're thinking about action, I think that we often think about that in very specific ways, but we expand our ideas of what action can mean. And sometimes that's just continuing to sit with someone that we might say, so when we're thinking about that 3-step process, listen, validate, and offer action, we might listen, acknowledge what they're experiencing, and then just say, can you tell me more about that, or can we talk a little bit more about that? It may be offering breaths or other kinds of body-based practices or mind-body practices. We may say, would it be helpful to take a walk or to move around or to get out of this environment? Or it's just offering to continue, can we have time? We can continue to sit here if that would be helpful. So we expand our ideas of what's possible and what's action in the moment. And we know that providing a menu of options can be really helpful when someone can't tell you and they're experiencing crisis, and that we don't want to offer too long of a menu, right? So we don't want to be like, what about this, 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 or this, or this, because that can itself be overwhelming, but offering ideas can give someone an idea of, oh no, that would feel right, or yes, this would feel right, or no, that's not right at all, which can help get closer to something that might feel possible. And that when we listen and validate and offer action that's possible, that one of the things I think that we're really doing, and when we're doing that from a place of genuine presence and connection, that we're countering that experience that many people have when they're in crisis of not being believed, not being safe or feeling safe. And I think that helps us move into a place where we can be more collaborative and to not be using force or coercion or power over or trying to get someone to calm down or to sort of move someone into something that they're not ready to move into. And Cathy?
So thinking here is really around, so what do we need as supporters and advocates? It's part of it is, someone put in the chat box, our patience and presence are everything. And it's how we do that. So what will sustain us in our work so that our own ability to stay present, to stay empathetic, to stay connected when folks can't tell us what they need is really the work that incorporates a lot of what we've been saying, for this time together that we've been on the webinar. So what I would ask folks to consider is to share ideas about what's helpful to you, because I think some of our response to this question is really unique. But to also think about, are there ways that you can incorporate some of the things that we've suggested here in terms of mind-body practice and knowing what the policies and procedures are, to being able to access support from other people around you. So is there, is it helpful to you to have someone else know where you are, of what kind of conversation you're in the middle of, and then to give you space to have it? What kinds of strategies would be helpful? So we will talk more about this, in further webinars, but I think central to this conversation is really, what am I willing to try? What do I already do? And are there some things that I can think about that we've discussed today that can expand my own capacity to stay connected? So let's, kind of carry on this conversation as we, move forward in our work and, again, on future webinars. So this was shared from survivors kind of talking about, excuse me, what has been helpful to them. So when I'm in crisis, here are some things that are helpful to me. I need someone who can be with me when I'm in distress, be present with me when I am in pain, who will acknowledge my pain without trying to fix it. That this takes someone who knows her or his pain and is not afraid of it or yours. So really thinking about what does this mean to stay present with someone. There's a poem that I like to share by Araya Mountain Dreamer, and there's a piece of it where she says, can you sit with pain, mine or your own, without moving to hide it or fix it or fade it? And it takes a lot, and it takes a lot of being present, but it also takes us as individuals and as teams of people who are doing the work, staying connected to what's helpful to us and being able to try to make sure we have resources of our own to regulate and reset so that we can support ourselves and sustain our empathy, and have organizations that work to do that too in a collaborative way. Here are some additional resources that we have available on the center website, and I know Erin's been sharing some resources as the conversation's been going. We certainly look forward to hearing if you'll have questions or specific ideas for tools that would be helpful. That would also add to the conversation, and we really appreciate your time and attention and presence here today. So we have maybe 2 minutes.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes or so if there's any questions. Any pressing questions that are coming up in those last few minutes. Otherwise, we can close, and then knowing that we'll continue these conversations with everyone moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. This is Erin. We got a number of really excellent questions. I think given the time frame, it's probably best to maybe follow up. I can include some responses in my follow-up email that I'll send in a week, and we can kind of go from there.
That sounds great.
So great. With that,
thanks, Erin.
I want to thank you both so much. I want to extend a huge thank you to Cathy and Jen for such an exceptional and informative webinar. Thank you to Caption Colorado for providing today's captioning, and thank you to Angelica Medina for making the webinar run so smoothly. Last but not least, I want to thank all of you for spending your time with this center today. As I stated in the chat a little bit, within the next week, I'll send you all a follow-up email with a link of the recording of today's webinar, in addition to the slides and handouts that were referenced, most of which will be available on our website, and I will also include any of the additional links that folks contributed. I will also include the presenter's contact information if you want to follow up with any of your specific questions that we weren't able to get to today. You will also receive a certificate of attendance for your time today. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation, and if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, we would really appreciate it. So thank you all again, and we hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.